Have you ever been humiliated on the very day you most hoped to be remembered fondly? Have you ever felt the weight of hearing from your own family that you no longer matter, as if you were just a forgotten detail in the house you helped build? On my birthday, in front of all my loved ones, I heard the words no mother or grandmother should ever hear. Parties are only for those who are still truly alive. You no longer count. In that moment, it was as if the ground had fallen out from under me. The food was still warm on the table, the presents wrapped, and yet their laughter rang out louder than any memory of my sacrifices. I stood there, trying to understand how this could be possible. How could someone who spent their entire life dedicating sleepless nights, giving up on dreams, caring for every detail of their children's and grandchildren's lives, be reduced to such a cruel sentence? Have you ever been there? Have you ever felt invisible among the people who should be your strength? It's a pain that corrodes inside, a humiliation that doesn't scream but weighs like a deafening silence. The most painful thing wasn't just the sentence itself, but the naturalness with which it was said, accompanied by laughter. Laughter from people I'd cradled in my arms, who I'd taught to take their first steps, who I'd encouraged through their first mistakes. There, in front of everyone, it felt like my entire life had been erased, as if nothing had any value. And I wondered, had all my effort, all my love, all my dedication, been lost over time? As they laughed, my heart filled with a mixture of shame, sadness, and indignation. I wanted to scream. I wanted to ask if they had any idea what those words meant. But at the same time, I knew that screaming wouldn't change anything. What they didn't know is that, within me, a silent strength was being born. Because the truth is that real stories, stories that touch the heart, aren't just made of joy, but also of moments when we have to face contempt head-on. That day, my birthday, the cake was still whole and the candles hadn't yet been lit. And yet, I felt as if I'd aged 10 years in a matter of seconds. The scene seemed like one of those family stories no one believes until they've heard it. But I was there, experiencing firsthand the symbolic disregard of the most important date of my life. They laughed, and I thought of the years I'd sacrificed so they wouldn't lack for anything. I thought of every outfit I'd neglected to buy, every meal I'd prepared, every night I'd spent nursing fevers. I thought of how my entire life seemed summed up in a single sentence that denied me even the right to celebrate. And perhaps you've felt something similar. Perhaps you've also done everything for someone and, in the end, received only silence, disregard, or humiliation. If this has happened to you, you know exactly what I'm talking about. The feeling of being unseen, of being treated as if time had erased your importance, is one of the deepest pains anyone can carry. But in that moment, amidst that brightly lit room filled with laughter that sounded like daggers, a decision began to form within me. I would not bow my head. I would not let them reduce me to that. Because there are times when life demands that we stand up, even if silently, and show that dignity cannot be bought or erased. And it was like that, between the still untouched cake and the words echoing in my chest, that something began to shift inside me. They didn't realize it at the time, but their every gesture was pushing me toward a choice that would change everything. And that's precisely when my story begins to take a different turn. My name is Eleanor, I'm 72 years old, and for a long time, I proudly carried the mark of being the one who brought the family together. I was the woman of details, the smell of bread fresh from the oven on Sunday mornings, the chocolate cake my grandchildren asked for at every visit, the table set with a flowered tablecloth and glasses, even when it was just for a simple dinner at home. Life has never been about luxury, but I've always found beauty in what I could offer. For me, every small gesture was a way of saying, "You are important, you are my reason for being." I celebrated their every achievement as if it were my own. When my son got his first job, I was the one who insisted on cooking dinner for the whole family. When my granddaughter started college, I handwrote a congratulations letter myself, along with a gift I'd saved months to buy. I never needed much to feel complete, because their joy was enough. Perhaps that's why the humiliation I experienced hurt so much. Because I had built my entire identity around the idea that my family would be my reward. I always saw myself as the silent foundation, the one behind the scenes, making sure everything happened. I wasn't in the most important photos, I was rarely mentioned in the stories they told others, but I knew I was there, in every detail. Do you know what I mean? That feeling that, even without recognition, you were indispensable? I believed it. I believed that, deep down, they knew and valued it. But over time, I realized that this hidden truth wasn't so clear. There were signs. Small things, but they accumulated. Phone calls that were once frequent became rare. Birthday presents that began to disappear. Invitations that no longer arrived. I tried to justify it. They're busy, the world has changed, it's normal. But inside me, there was always that weight of someone who realizes the distance but doesn't want to face reality. Because admitting it would mean accepting that all the sacrifices, all the choices, perhaps hadn't had the impact I imagined. And you know what's cruelest? I sacrificed myself so many times, believing I was doing the right thing. I worked extra hours, turned down trips, and gave up personal dreams, all with the mindset that I was building a legacy. I believed that being a mother and grandmother was my greatest mission, and that recognition would come naturally. But recognition never came. Instead, silence, indifference, and, ultimately, contempt arrived. It's not easy to admit this. It hurts to say out loud that you've dedicated your entire life to believing in something that perhaps only made sense to you. But it takes courage to face these revelations. The truth is, as painful as it may be, we need to look back and understand who we were and what we accepted. This journey isn't just about getting older, but about realizing how some relationships change unexpectedly. And I, who was always the hostess of parties, who prepared abundant tables for everyone, ended up discovering that the greatest loneliness can occur even within a crowded room. This is the impact when we realize that what we believe to be eternal can turn into cold silence. But at the same time, there's a hidden turning point there. Because when you realize that the value you imagined you'd receive won't come from outside, a different perspective begins to emerge within you. A silent, almost imperceptible transformation, but one that gradually takes hold. I just didn't know at the time that this transformation was about to bring me face to face with the harshest of truths. And it was in this contrast, between the happy memories and the signs of neglect, that I began to understand that something was changing. It wasn't just my advancing age, it wasn't just my routine changing. It was something deeper, some kind of invisible shift that I couldn't yet name. I only knew that, behind the laughter that had once been genuine, a heavy silence was beginning to emerge. And this silence would be the harbinger of everything that was yet to come. At first, they were just small signs, almost imperceptible to the outsider, but inside me they resonated like uncomfortable echoes. My gifts, once received with broad smiles and gratitude, began to be tossed aside, as if they didn't matter. I remembered every detail I put into them, the choice of wrapping paper, the carefully tied bow, the meaningful keepsake. But suddenly, all of it seemed invisible. A gift left forgotten on a table, a note no one bothered to read. I told myself, they're busy, modern life is just like that. But deep down, I knew there was something more, a cold distance that lingered over me like a shadow. The hugs changed too. Before, they were tight, full of warmth, as if they were silent confirmations that I was still needed. But gradually, they became mechanical, quick gestures, almost like a convenient greeting. I felt my arms wrap around them with all the strength of a mother or a grandmother, but on the other side, there wasn't the same surrender. That emptiness hurt more than any dismissive words. Because the body speaks when the mouth is silent, and those cold hugs told me a hidden truth I didn't want to accept. I was losing space in their hearts. And it was during this period that memories of the past began to invade my thoughts. I mentally returned to the days when life was simpler, but love seemed greater. I recalled sleepless nights nursing fevers, preparing home remedies, singing softly to help me fall asleep. I remembered postponing personal dreams to ensure they were fulfilled. While others traveled, I was at home, saving every penny to buy new notebooks at the start of the school year. Each choice was a sacrifice I made silently, believing that this love would one day be recognized. And, ironically, it was this very love that now seemed worthless. The human mind has a curious way of dealing with pain. We try to justify the unjustifiable. I kept telling myself that youth is rushed, that commitments take time, that life consumed them too much for them to notice small gestures. But deep down, there was an open wound. The impact of those strange signals was greater than I wanted to admit. Every time a connection didn't come, every time an invitation was forgotten, every time a glance didn't reach me, it was as if part of my history was erased before my eyes. And the truth is, no matter how much I tried to fool myself, that growing indifference wasn't just a distraction. It was a choice. They decided not to listen to me, not to see me, not to value me. And that revelation was one of the hardest of my journey. Because when you realize you're no longer a priority, that the love you gave goes unanswered, it's as if the ground in your life shifts. There were nights when I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, remembering the past. It was as if my heart created little flashbacks of everything I'd experienced. The first time I held my son in my arms, the smell of talcum powder after bath time, the laughter that filled the house on ordinary afternoons. I wondered, how had all this turned to silence? How could a lifetime of dedication be lost in memories that no longer seemed to have meaning to them? The most painful thing was realizing that, even in the face of these signs, I kept trying. I kept buying gifts, I kept preparing meals, I kept hoping for more sincere hugs. It was as if I were trapped in a hope that no longer made sense. But still, I persisted. Because that's the mentality of a mother and grandmother. Believing until the very last moment, believing even when reality shows otherwise. And little by little, I began to notice that my own identity was unraveling in this process. I no longer knew if I was doing things out of true love or out of fear of disappearing from their lives forever. This silent transformation within me was perhaps one of the greatest shocks I've ever faced. Because I, who had always seen myself as a strong woman, now realized I carried a void I didn't know how to fill. But if there's one thing life has taught me, it's that no truth can be hidden forever. The shadows of what seemed like a perfect family were already showing me a crack. And that crack, sooner or later, would open wide. The signs were there, clear, but I still tried to deny it. Until the day came when denial was no longer possible. The silent hugs, the ignored gifts, and the empty stares accumulated until they became an invisible scream. And it was at that point that my journey began to take a direction I could never have imagined. That morning, everything seemed different. The sun streamed through the window with a softer light than usual, and for a moment, I believed that perhaps life was offering me a silent gift. When I heard my granddaughter Emily's light footsteps coming up the stairs, my heart raced like a teenager waiting for a surprise. She entered the room with that sweet way that always reminded me of her early years, when she would run into my arms without fear. Emily kissed me on the cheek and said, with the excitement only young people can convey, that she was excited for the party that night. In that moment, all the accumulated pain of the past few years seemed to vanish. It was as if those words had erased, even if only for a few seconds, the weight of absences, indifference, and silent humiliations I had already been facing. My chest filled with joy, and I believed. I believed that perhaps that day was truly special, that my family still had room for gratitude, for memory, and for true love. Have you ever experienced this? That feeling that, even after so many strange signs, a single gesture can rekindle all the hope you had buried within? As she spoke, my eyes shone as if I were facing a revelation. I thought to myself, maybe I've overreacted, maybe I'm being too harsh. Maybe all the signs I'd noticed were just the result of my own sensitivity. That was the mindset that dominated me at that moment, believing that a granddaughter's affection could be proof that there was still love in all that. And it was this belief that made me sink into a false hope, as if I would finally reap the fruits of the life I'd sown with so much sacrifice. I spent the rest of the morning preparing every detail, as I always did. I carefully chose my outfit, a printed blouse I saved for special occasions, and sprayed on perfume as if I wanted to relive my youth. In the kitchen, the smell of freshly baked cake filled the house, and for a few moments, I saw myself backstage at so many old parties, where my greatest joy was seeing the smiles on their faces. I truly believed that this day would be different, that the transformation I'd longed for was finally happening. As I set the table, I remembered past celebrations. Flashbacks invaded my mind like small fragments of old movies. I saw myself younger, with the energy to run from one place to another, arranging chairs, arranging flowers, and laying out colorful napkins. These were memories that carried the impact of a lifetime dedicated to family. I remembered the laughter, the soft music playing on the radio, the lively conversations that filled the room. With every detail, I believed that all of that could happen again, that there was still room for that joy. But the hidden truth is that sometimes life offers us small glimmers of hope only to prepare us for even harder falls. And that day, I was completely surrendered to this illusion. I smiled to myself, thinking how wonderful it would be to blow out the candles surrounded by loving gazes. I even silently rehearsed a thank you speech, imagining the moment I would tell them how much they meant to me. This was my unconscious decision, to choose to believe, even if the signs of the past screamed otherwise. Emily, with her youthful, spontaneous nature, had no idea the impact her words had on me. She simply repeated something that seemed natural to her, but to me it was like a breath of life. I watched her leave the room and continue her routine, unaware that she had just rekindled a flame that had been nearly extinguished within me. And it's curious how the mind works at these times. We cling to the smallest gesture as if it were irrefutable proof of love. I sat on the edge of the bed, closed my eyes, and took a deep breath, feeling a peace I hadn't felt in a long time. It was as if my journey of pain and silence was finally reaching a turning point. As the afternoon wore on, every little detail seemed to confirm this hope. The house grew busier, voices began to fill the spaces, and my heart beat faster with anticipation. I paced the floor with the feeling that, finally, I would be seen, heard, and valued. I believed that all my absences would be made up for that day, that life would give me back, in the form of celebration, everything I had given up until that point. But life, as it has so often shown me, holds unexpected revelations. What I didn't know was that that false hope was only paving the way for the greatest disappointment I would face. And it was in this contrast, between my granddaughter's kiss and the emptiness that was yet to come, that the true face of that night began to silently emerge, without me realizing what was about to happen. When night fell, the house was already full. Voices mingled in the air, glasses clinked, and for a few minutes I truly believed I was experiencing a celebration like the old ones. The cake sat on the table, covered in colorful candles that seemed to beckon me to a moment of joy. I observed every detail, feeling a warmth in my chest, as if it were proof that everything could still be restored. Emily smiled at me every now and then, and that was enough to sustain the illusion that life still held moments of true affection for me. But when the moment of congratulations arrived, that moment that always represented unity and affection, something inside me broke. My son Mark, with a laugh laden with irony, looked at me and uttered the words that would echo in my mind for a long time. "Mom, spending money on a party for you? That's for people who still live." The silence lasted only a second, but soon after, the room erupted in laughter. Laughter that wasn't just sounds, but daggers piercing my heart. Even Susan, my daughter-in-law, added, chuckling softly, "It's true, it really doesn't make sense." I stood there, a smile frozen on my face, trying to maintain my composure. Have you ever been there? Have you ever felt your soul burn inside while on the outside you have to pretend nothing happened? It's the quietest vulnerability there is. A moment when you feel exposed in front of everyone, as if your entire life has been reduced to a cruel joke. While everyone laughed, all I could think about was how ironic fate can be. I, who spent my life organizing parties for each of them, was now the butt of ridicule at my own celebration. Inside me, a whirlwind of memories swirled. I remembered the times when Mark, as a little boy, would blow out the candles on the cake I'd prepared with such care, the sparkle in his eyes when he saw the wrapped presents, the late nights I'd spent sewing costumes for school parties. And now, that same son was saying, in front of everyone, that I no longer had the right to a proper birthday. This contrast between a past of dedication and a present of contempt is the kind of revelation that not only hurts, but also transforms. My eyes began to water, but I held them back. I knew that if I cried there, the laughter would become even louder. So I took a deep breath, lifted my head, and fell silent. Sometimes silence is more powerful than any words. But inside, my heart screamed. It felt like I was surrounded by people who carried my blood, but who at that moment were strangers, unable to see the woman who dedicated her life to them. That moment marked a shift in my mindset. It was then that I realized the true impact of the choices I'd made throughout my journey. I had so often dismissed myself, believing that love would be reciprocated, that gratitude would come naturally. But the hidden truth is that sacrifice doesn't always generate recognition. Sometimes it just breeds complacency. And seeing everyone laughing, as if my worth had faded with age, I understood that I was facing one of the greatest revelations of my life. I looked at Emily, who looked uncomfortable, and noticed something different in her eyes. She wasn't laughing, she wasn't amused. Her expression was one of shock and embarrassment. And it was in that look that I found a small spark of hope. Because, amidst so much cruel laughter, there was at least one silent witness who saw the injustice. I wanted to stand up, scream, ask how they had the nerve to treat me that way. But I didn't. My hands were shaking, and for a moment I thought I wouldn't be able to stand. However, I took a deep breath and chose to resist. Sometimes the biggest decisions happen without words, just inside us. And in that moment, my decision was not to let myself fall apart in front of them. The cake was still there, untouched, the candles still waiting to be lit. But for me, that party was already tarnished. Every laugh echoed like a confirmation that I no longer belonged there. And at the same time, each laugh also gave me strength, as if it were a push to see the truth I didn't want to see. The impact of that night wasn't limited to the words spoken. It expanded within me, stirring my memories, my identity, my beliefs. It was as if the entire backstory of my life was being revealed at once, revealing that the unconditional love I'd offered wasn't being returned. And this revelation hurt, but it also ignited something new within me. Because, in the midst of that public humiliation, I realized my journey wouldn't end there. On the contrary, it was just beginning. The pain of being exposed like that in front of everyone was the trigger for a silent transformation that no one there noticed. But I knew that, from that moment on, nothing would be the same. And so, amidst laughter that seemed endless and a cake that no longer made sense, I began to feel that something inside me was growing silently, preparing the way for a choice that would change everything. I smiled silently, as if that smile were a mask capable of hiding what was truly happening inside me. On the outside, I seemed resigned, almost indifferent to their laughter, but inside, something broke definitively. It was as if all the years of dedication, all the sacrifices, all the memories of affection had been thrown at me all at once. That untouched cake, that lavish table I myself had helped prepare, it all seemed a cruel irony in the face of the hidden truth that was finally revealed. I was no longer part of their world, I was merely a tolerated presence. And it was in that moment, as I took a deep breath to keep the tears from falling, that I felt something unexpected rise within me. A silent force, almost invisible to outsiders, but which ignited me from within. I thought, "You don't know who you're dealing with." It was a phrase that echoed like a secret promise, a pact I made with myself at that moment. Because if they believed I would crumble under the humiliation, they were deeply mistaken. This decision wasn't loud, without confrontational words or angry outbursts. It was an intimate decision, made in the shadows of my mind, and it carried far more weight than any shout could have. I knew that from that moment on, something would change, not only in the way I related to them, but in the way I saw myself. Because, for the first time in a long time, I realized that there were still choices to be made, and that I wasn't condemned to accept that invisible role. As everyone continued to laugh, I watched each of them silently. My son, with an arrogant, satisfied look, thinking he'd told a brilliant joke. My daughter-in-law, laughing complicitly, unaware of the devastating impact of the words coming from her mouth. And even the guests, some laughing out of politeness, others just staring, as if watching an uncomfortable spectacle. I watched them as if seeing for the first time who they truly were. The mask of perfect relationships had fallen, and the harsh truth was revealed before me. It was in that long look at each of them that I realized how much my mindset needed to change. I'd always put myself second, always accepted the idea that my role was to serve, to support, to be available. But that night I realized this was a choice I'd made myself, and now it was time to undo it. The impact of those words would no longer paralyze me. Instead, they would fuel a silent transformation. And, even if no one noticed, my decision had already been made. I kept smiling, feigning naturalness, but every beat of my heart brought with it a revelation. I would never be the same after that night. It was as if life had placed me before an invisible mirror, and in it I could see not only the wrinkles of time, but the marks of an entire journey of choices that now needed to be re-evaluated. It wasn't just about the birthday, nor just about a party turned into public humiliation. It was about my entire story being challenged to find a new direction. Because I understood that if I didn't make a decision right then, I would be condemning myself to live in the same cycle of contempt and invisibility. And this revelation was as clear as it was painful. I needed to stand up, even if it was in silence. It's funny how sometimes the biggest changes begin with the smallest decisions. I didn't say anything, I didn't bang on the table, I didn't confront anyone. I just took a deep breath, straightened my posture, and allowed them to believe they were winning. What they didn't know is that, at that very moment, I was already mentally preparing the next step. Because there's a kind of strength that's born from vulnerability, and I felt it grow within me like a seed finally finding space to blossom. As the party continued, I watched the laughter echo through the room, but I no longer heard it in the same way. It was as if each cruel word had lost its power to hurt me, because something inside me was rebuilding itself. And in the process, I realized that my journey would never be the same. The transformation had already begun, even if no one noticed. And it was in this contrast between their laughter and the silence that enveloped me that I felt, for the first time, that I was about to turn the page. I didn't know exactly how or when, but I knew that my silent decision would change everything. And in that moment, while the candles on the cake were still waiting to be lit, I could already see a different future unfolding before me, ready to be revealed. While all this was happening, I maintained that discreet smile, as if resigned, but something inside me was already stirring. It wasn't just anger, nor just sadness. It was a mixture of revelation and quiet strength, a clarity that was born right there, in front of a room full of people who believed they were diminishing me. It was in that moment that I understood that life sometimes puts us in situations like this, not to destroy us, but to show us the hidden truth we try to hide from ourselves. And maybe you've been through something similar. Maybe you've also felt the weight of being ignored, humiliated, or left aside by those who should be on your side. If any part of this story has ever touched you, if something has ever revolted you or brought back memories, leave your thoughts in the comments below. Sharing what we feel is a way to create a community of voices that no longer accept silence. Each comment helps not only empower those who read it, but also shows that no one is alone on this journey. And if you believe stories like this deserve to be told and heard, like this video. It may seem small, but each like is a sign that this message is reaching where it needs to go. It's what allows more people to receive this content, more hearts to connect with these real stories, and for outrage to turn into reflection. And of course, if you feel this kind of narrative speaks to you, if you want to continue following this journey and so many other revelations yet to come, subscribe to the channel. Your subscription is what keeps this space alive. It's what gives me the strength to continue bringing stories that touch the heart, expose truths, and help us think about the choices we make in life. I say this because I believe that when we unite around such human experiences, we create something greater than just a video. We create a support network, a collective mindset that refuses to normalize ingratitude and contempt. And every gesture you make here, whether commenting, liking, or subscribing, is part of this transformation. As I stood there, staring at that illuminated table, pretending everything was fine, I already carried this silent decision within me. And it was from that moment that my story began to take a path no one in that room could have imagined. That night, after everyone had dispersed and the house fell silent, I sat alone at the table, staring at the unlit candles. The party had happened, yes, but not for me. It was as if that untouched cake was the perfect metaphor for my life at that moment. Prepared with care, full of meaning, yet ignored, forgotten, treated as something worthless. I felt a mixture of emptiness and clarity. It was as if, in that moment of solitude, I had received a harsh but necessary revelation. The hidden truth I had avoided facing finally forced itself upon me. I was no longer seen as an essential part of their lives. The pain of that realization was immense, but with it came something unexpected. A kind of strength born not from joy, but from humiliation. I spent the night awake, remembering the behind the scenes of my entire journey, every sacrifice made in silence, every choice I put on hold to sustain their happiness. And as these memories played out before me like a movie, something began to shift in my mindset. For the first time in a long time, I didn't cry like someone who feels defeated. I cried like someone who understands the time has come to turn the page. It was in this state of wakefulness that the decision was born. It wouldn't be an outburst of rage. It wouldn't be a revenge filled with cutting words. It would be a silent, firm, and definitive turnaround. That early morning, I repeated to myself, money doesn't buy respect. And I won't finance ingratitude. It was simple, but it carried all the impact of a lifetime of choices. For the first time, I wasn't thinking about what I would lose if I stood up for myself. I was thinking about what I had already lost by not standing up for myself sooner. The next morning, the house was silent, but I wasn't. A new strength welled up inside me, almost impossible to explain. I called everyone into the living room, one by one. My voice didn't tremble. On the contrary, there was a calm that surprised even me. They gathered around, perhaps expecting me to apologize or pretend nothing had happened. But when they saw me standing before them, they realized something had changed. I looked each of them in the eye, took a deep breath, and said, "The party has been paid for, but from now on, gifts and allowances are cancelled. Money doesn't buy respect, and I don't condone ingratitude." The silence that followed was absolute. There was no laughter, no whispers, just that weight in the air that reveals when a truth is spoken with no possibility of return. I saw Mark's face contort in disbelief, Susan lower her eyes to avoid confrontation, and even some of the grandchildren look at each other, unsure of what was happening. But I knew that in that moment I had regained control of my own story. It wasn't just a financial decision. It was a moral turning point. Because behind the money was something much greater, the breaking of a mindset that had haunted me for years. I'd always believed that giving, providing, and offering were proof of love. But that morning I understood that love cannot be confused with convenience. My revelation was simple yet powerful. Those who give without limits teach others to receive without gratitude. And their reactions made the impact of my decision clear. Mark tried to hide it with a nervous smile, but the tone of his voice betrayed him. "Mom, you can't be serious." Susan just shook her head, as if in disbelief. And it was at that moment that I realized the power of what I had just done. For the first time, my words weren't ignored. For the first time, the weight of my presence was felt. It's strange, but in that moment, even in the face of their discomfort, I felt peace. Peace because I was finally honoring myself. Peace because I understood that my journey would not be defined by the ingratitude of others, but by the decision to no longer feed what diminished me. It was a silent but definitive transformation. And it's curious how, sometimes, a single gesture is enough to change the entire dynamic. I didn't raise my voice, I didn't bang on the table, I didn't make a fuss. I simply said, calmly and firmly, what needed to be said. And that simple act had more impact than any shout could have. In that moment, I was no longer the invisible woman everyone believed I was manipulating. I was someone who had found her voice again, even if only in a few words. And as I watched their expressions change, I realized this was just the beginning. Because a decision like this doesn't end the moment it's made. It opens the door to new revelations, new consequences, and a transformation that was yet to come. The silence that filled the room was so dense I could almost touch it. It was as if all that laughter from the previous night had turned to stones, falling one by one to the floor, until only the weight of the truth remained. I stood firm, my heart racing, but serene, as if I had already known that this scene needed to happen exactly this way. My son, accustomed to always having the last word, seemed paralyzed. He, who so often raised his voice to impose his will, now had nothing to say. His lips moved, as if searching for an excuse, but no words came. And for the first time in a long time, I saw in his eyes not superiority, but fear. My daughter-in-law, Susan, lowered her head. Maybe it wasn't regret. Maybe it was just shame at having participated in the humiliation without a second thought. But the fact is, she couldn't hold her gaze. It was as if something invisible was forcing her to acknowledge that the game had changed. And it was in that moment that I sensed something greater hovering in that space. It wasn't just me imposing my decision. It was as if a divine force had descended upon that room to demonstrate that the law of return never fails. I didn't need to raise my voice. I didn't need to accuse anyone directly. It was enough to firmly declare that I would no longer fund ingratitude. And in that exact moment, all the years of sacrifice that seemed forgotten came flooding back like a vivid memory, impossible to ignore. It wasn't just me speaking. It was a lifetime taking its toll. The hidden truth so many had tried to ignore was finally revealed. The impact was immediate. Mark knew better than anyone how much he depended on my monthly support. He'd always treated it as my obligation, as if it were natural for me to bear his shortcomings without question. But now, hearing my words, I saw fear creep into his face. It was the fear of someone who realizes they can no longer hide behind the generosity of others. The fear of someone who understands, however late, that every choice has consequences. And I, who had so often felt small and invisible, realized the transformation taking place before me. It was no longer about revenge. It was about justice. It was about showing that dignity is priceless, and that no relationship can survive based solely on exploitation. I felt that in that moment, God was silently and accurately writing the lesson they needed to learn. The children fell silent too, as if instinctively sensing something serious was happening. Emily, my granddaughter, looked at me with a mixture of admiration and surprise. It was as if she saw, for the first time, the strength that had always been hidden behind my silent gestures. And that look made me even more certain that I had made the right choice. Because educating isn't just about giving affection, it's also about teaching by example. And perhaps that was the greatest gift I could leave. Proof that a lifetime of submission can, indeed, give way to the courage to assert oneself. As I watched each person's reaction, I thought of all the times I'd heard phrases like, "What you sow, you reap," or "God sees everything." These words, which so often seemed cliché, took on a whole new meaning. Because in that moment, I was a living witness to the fact that nothing goes unnoticed in life. The backstories of what had seemed like a solid family were now exposed, and every detail showed that their contempt would not go unpunished. I didn't take pleasure in seeing them uncomfortable. It wasn't about that. What I felt was peace. Peace because balance was finally being restored. Peace because I understood I no longer had to carry the burden alone. Peace because, before God and my own conscience, I knew I had acted justly. It wasn't anger that moved me. It was the certainty that love without respect isn't love, it's prison. And in that heavy silence, I realized that my journey wouldn't end there. On the contrary, something greater was just beginning. I didn't yet know what the practical consequences of my decision would be, but I felt that each revelation that followed was part of an inevitable process. Life was showing me, clearly and even painfully, that the time had come to change my place within my own story. And so I stood there, standing firm, watching every face before me. There were no more jokes, no more wry smiles, just the discomfort that arises when the truth finally imposes itself. It was as if they all understood, without me needing to repeat it, that the party was over. And not just for that night, but the party of a lifetime where they had grown accustomed to laughing at my expense. What they didn't yet know was that this shift wasn't just financial or practical. It was moral, spiritual, a transformation from the inside out. And it was in this contrast between the heavy silence and my unexpected calm that I realized my story still had much to unfold. On that day when everything changed, when silence weighed more than any words and the law of return showed its strength before my very eyes, something inside me awakened irreversibly. I felt, for the first time in a long time, that I was no longer living just to please, support, or endure. I was living for myself. It was a simple yet transformative revelation. dignity is also a gift, and no one could take that away from me. In the days that followed, I realized there was no reason to expect recognition from those who had chosen to ignore me. So I made a decision that was both practical and symbolic. I went to the local florist and bought myself flowers. Flowers that weren't tied to any special occasion, any gesture of apology, but simply to the celebration of the life that still flowed within me. I placed the bouquet on the living room table, where I had so often stood alone in the face of emptiness, and felt that, for the first time in years, that space was filled with a different energy. I began to recreate small rituals that had previously been focused on others. That first Sunday, I cooked my favorite dish, not to please anyone, not to impress, but because I wanted to taste again what brought back good memories. I sat alone at the table, savored each bite calmly, and it was as if each flavor carried a silent message. You're still here, you still matter, you don't need anyone's approval to feel alive. And that's when I discovered the strength that comes when we stop waiting and start acting. I no longer depended on the validation of children or daughters-in-law. No longer needed to measure my worth by the gratitude that never came. I began inviting only those who truly valued me to share moments with me. A neighbor who was always kind, a longtime friend who was often forgotten in the rush of life. And in these simple but sincere encounters, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time: belonging. Not by blood, but by the bond of respect and true affection. This transformation was silent but intense. Because deep down, the greatest lesson of my journey came not from the humiliating party, but from the decision not to lose myself in the pain it caused. I could have wallowed in resentment, I could have closed myself off in grief, but I chose another path. I chose to rebuild my strength, brick by brick, reminding myself that life doesn't end when others stop seeing us. On the contrary, sometimes that's when it truly begins. I knew people would comment, that some would say I was different. And they were right. The difference was in the look in my eyes, in the way I walked, in the silence that once carried pain but now carried determination. Each step was guided by a new mindset. I am not just what others think of me, I am what I choose to be. This revelation was liberating, yet painful. Because rebuilding one's strength requires facing head on the hidden truth that we often nullify ourselves by believing this to be love. But I learned that love without respect is empty. And I was no longer willing to feed that emptiness. It was then that I began to look at each day with a different perspective. If before I anxiously awaited calls that never came, now I got up and did something that brought me joy, even if it was just a walk in the garden or writing a letter to myself. If before I waited for cold hugs, now I allowed myself to feel the warmth of small acts of kindness from unexpected people. This rebuilding process wasn't quick, but it was profound. Because it showed me that life always offers us the chance to start over, even when we believe there's no way forward. And that's exactly what I felt. A fresh start. Not a return to what once was, but a new phase, built with the awareness of someone who has already understood the difference between giving out of love and giving out of obligation. And every time I placed fresh flowers on the table, every time I allowed myself to cook something just for myself, every time I surrounded myself only with those who made me feel good, I felt the wound healing. It didn't disappear completely, because some pains leave a lasting mark, but it stopped being a prison. It became simply part of my story, a part that now strengthened me instead of weakening me. It was through this process that I understood that dignity is not a luxury, not a whim. It is a vital necessity. Without it, any act of love loses its meaning. With it, even solitude can become companionship. And I was rediscovering, step by step, that life still had much to offer, as long as I was willing to look at it with new eyes. And so, as I continued my transformed routine, I knew that this decision to celebrate myself wasn't the end of anything, but the beginning of a new journey. And it was at this point, amidst colorful flowers and silent meals, that something unexpected happened, something that would forever change the way I saw not only my family, but also myself. When I look back and reflect on everything that happened, I can't help but feel that every detail of that journey was necessary for me to see what, for years, I'd been denying myself. The humiliation, the heavy silence, the laughter that echoed like open wounds, all of it could have destroyed me. But instead, It forced me to make decisions I never would have dared to make before. It's curious how life sometimes chooses the most painful paths to reveal the hidden truth we insist on hiding. I learned, with a direct impact on my heart, that dignity is not negotiable. And as difficult as it may be, there are times when we need to distance ourselves from those who don't know how to value us, so we can rediscover our own voice. This is what made me understand that true transformation doesn't happen when others change, but when we choose to change ourselves. For a long time, I lived waiting for recognition that never came. I believed my role was to serve, to provide, to always be available, and that this unconditional love would bring me back respect and care. But what I found was indifference. This revelation was harsh, but liberating. Because by understanding that it wasn't my responsibility to carry the weight of everything alone, I allowed myself to breathe again. I began to walk differently, with a mindset that no longer rested on the need for acceptance, but on the certainty that I deserved respect. And in this process, I realized something that completely changed my outlook. Those who sow ingratitude reap loneliness. This is the law of return, silent but infallible. I saw it happen before my eyes. That scornful laughter gradually turned into awkward silences. The power they believed they had over me evaporated when they realized I would no longer finance their ingratitude. And in place of the fragility they expected to see, they found a woman who, despite wrinkles and years of sacrifice, still carried within her a strength that could not be extinguished. But the opposite is also true. Those who sow love and dignity reap peace. This was the most beautiful revelation of my journey. When I began to take care of myself, to value myself, and to surround myself only with those who truly made a difference, peace returned to me. It wasn't a noisy peace, made of parties and grand celebrations. It was a quiet peace, one that came from simple gestures. Buying myself flowers, preparing my favorite meal, writing words that reminded me of who I was before I lost myself in the expectations of others. Today, I understand that celebrations don't need dates. Celebrations aren't just when someone remembers you. Celebrations are when you remember yourself. Celebrations are every day you choose to truly love yourself. And when this mindset takes hold within us, nothing else carries the same weight. Criticism doesn't bring us down, indifference doesn't define us, loneliness doesn't imprison us. Because we've learned that true value isn't in how others treat us, but in how we choose to treat ourselves. If you've ever felt discarded, if you've ever experienced the cold silence of those who should have supported you, I want you to know that there is a way out. There is a way to turn the page without having to erase your own history. Because everything you've experienced is part of your journey, but it doesn't have to determine your destiny. The impact of the choices we make today can completely transform tomorrow. And when we understand this, we gain the freedom to rebuild our lives our way, with new decisions, new paths, new revelations. I'm not saying this as someone who read it in a book or heard it from others. I'm saying it because I lived it. I experienced the pain of being humiliated in front of everyone. I experienced the vulnerability of feeling invisible in my own home. I experienced the transformation that arises when, silently, you decide you won't let yourself be broken anymore. And, above all, I experienced the peace that comes when you reconnect with yourself. Today I know I don't need applause to feel alive. I don't need grand parties to feel important. Because the greatest celebration anyone can have is looking in the mirror and knowing they're honoring their own dignity. And that's why, every day, I celebrate. It doesn't matter if there are guests. It doesn't matter if there's cake or gifts. What matters is that I'm here, whole, conscious, and at peace. And so, between memories and discoveries, I keep walking. Because life, with all its ups and downs, still holds revelations that I know are yet to come. And each new day is an opportunity to continue this journey, to learn more about myself and to show that, even after so many falls, it's still possible to get up and start over. If you've made it this far, it's because, in some way, this story spoke to you. And that makes me happy, because it's precisely this exchange that gives meaning to every word I share here. If this video made you reflect, if it ever triggered memories or brought up hidden emotions, leave the phrase, "This message was for me," in the comments. That way, I'll know you've walked with me to the end of this journey. subscribe to the channel to continue following real stories like this one, which bring not only emotion but also lessons that help us rethink our own choices. This space only makes sense because there are people like you, who value truth, reflection, and the strength that comes from life experiences. And if this content touched your heart, please leave a like. It's a simple gesture, but it really strengthens this community and ensures these messages reach those who also need to hear them. And since you're here with me, take advantage and continue the conversation in the next video. There's one right here that complements this topic and may open your eyes even further. Click and follow me there.